everyone from around the world, and thank you for joining us today. This is the first of a series that we have at CMED entitled The Hamas Attack and Its Impact on the Region. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the UCLA Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring our discussion today, as well as the UCLA International Institute for helping to promote this vital roundtable series. Before the event begins, please note the following important information, which I will go quickly on so we can start. Number one, while you can see us, we cannot see or hear you. You should know that. We are recording the presentation today, and the video will be available on the CMED website, YouTube, and our Facebook page soon after the event. If you are joining us using Zoom, please note the chat window at the bottom of the screen. We will share announcements during the talk with you here. However, you will not be able to add comments in the chat box. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the Q&A window, also at the bottom of your screen. You can ask one or both of our speakers. Be sure to include your name and your country and/or affiliation. That is critical, to include your name and your country and/or affiliation. And note that your name, country, and/or affiliation will be announced aloud along with your question. Only the CMED team will be able to see your questions. In some cases, we will answer questions in writing in the Q&A window for others to see. Please keep your questions concise so we can answer as many questions as possible. And if you're joining us on the YouTube platform, please note that we will not be replying to any comments or questions there. I want to begin by introducing two speakers, both of whom I just think are fantastic, and they are two of the most important people at the kind of crises that we are having now in the world. And I just can't thank them enough for having joined us. So we're going to be quick so we can get to as many questions and answers as we can in this limited time we have. Aaron David Miller has all sorts of positions. We love watching him. My wife and I love watching him on TV. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's always asking me to watch some of his material. He has written 5 books. He, of course, between 1978 and 2003, served as the State Department as a historian. He's got loads and loads of articles. He's, as I say, on TV, et cetera, all the time. Robin Wright is certainly one of the top authors about the kind of issues we're facing, seeing in the country. She's at the New Yorker. She's a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's been a reporter for more than 140 countries for the New Yorker. So I just want to say again, two of you, thank you so much for joining us. It means so much to us, so much to me. And we're going to start with Aaron David Miller.
Steve, thanks so much. It's really an honor to be here with you and with Robin, who grew up in Ann Arbor. We share a similar love affair with the Michigan Wolverines. Robin is one of the most talented journalists and analysts that I know, and it's always wonderful to be with her. I was going to just start, Steve, with 3 brief comments, not necessarily on the crisis itself, but 3 sort of comments that have helped me these last several weeks sort of look at this and process it. Number 1 is humility. What we know about this crisis unfolding greatly is diminished by what we do not know. Partly it's a function of a fast-moving media which reports breathlessly, usually without perspective and without knowledge on some of the key issues. Whether it's the hostages, which is an incredibly opaque situation, the looming Israeli ground campaign, promised, perhaps evolving, chances of escalation on the Israeli-Lebanese border. So much of what we're watching is opaque and really beyond our capacity to intuit, let alone analyze. Speculation can be harmful at times, but it runs rampant now. And that calls for real discipline, in my judgment, on our analysis and restraint in quickly reaching conclusions that aren't substantiated by facts and empirical data. That's point number one. Number two is humanity. Hamas's intentional and indiscriminate killing that took the lives of 1,400 Israelis on October 7th was unprecedented and breathtaking in its pure savagery and brutality. At the same time, those horrors cannot and should not prevent us from understanding, both from the perspective of our hearts and our minds, the suffering and the deaths of thousands of Palestinians as a consequence of Israeli strikes in an effort to strike back at Hamas. As Secretary Blinken has said, there's no hierarchy when it comes to the deaths of civilians in war, be they Israelis or Palestinians. And finally, just a note on hope and history. On October 6, 1973, I was in Jerusalem and watched an Israeli society traumatized by the October 1973 Yom Kippur War. And yet within 6 years of that trauma and the largest intelligence failure to date, that trauma would turn to hope with the signing of an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which still endures, however imperfect it may be. 20 years later, I watched on the White House lawn as President Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords. There, great hope turned to trauma. We really cannot see what's in front of us. Every breakthrough in the Arab-Israeli conflict zone, I will not include the Abraham Accords because they are not what I would describe as a conflict zone agreement, but every one in the conflict zone was preceded by terror, insurgency, and war, whether it was the 73 war, which produced Sadat's initiative, whether it was Baker's Madrid Peace Conference, which was driven in large part by Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the Bush 41 administration's efforts to push him out of Kuwait, or the failed Oslo process, and the successful Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, which were driven essentially by the first Intifada and changing Israeli and Palestinian calculations about a diplomatic process. The arc of history bends in very unpredictable ways, and maybe something of value will come out of this crisis. But one thing is clearly evident. Hoping isn't enough. If you want to bend the arc of history, humans have to work tirelessly in an effort to make sure it's bent in the right direction.
Robin, do you have anything else to say just as we start?
Aaron's covered a lot, and I'm always honored to be on with Aaron. Our lives have intersected in any number of ways. Traveling with secretaries of state, being on the same campus as students at Go Blue, Michigan. And we've shared positions at think tanks as well. And we agree on a lot. I think what I'd probably do is I've covered this tragedy in the Middle East for 50 years. I landed in Beirut on October 6, 1973. And I remember being at the airport in Beirut in the transit lounge. I was actually on my way to Iran. And a woman whispered to me very anxiously, "The Egyptians have just crossed the Suez Canal." What we've really seen play out is the evolution of a type of warfare that's important to understand. Between 1948 and 1973, Israel went through 4 conventional wars, but every war in the half century since then has pitted Israel against a non-state actor, be it the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hezbollah, Hamas, Hezbollah again, Hamas again. And it's very important, I think, to understand the pattern of warfare, because it is much harder to fight a non-state actor, to fight a militia, than it is to fight a state, where you know what the diplomatic address is, what the potential diplomatic engagement might be, and what an outcome might be in terms of peace. And I think with an unconventional actor, a non-state actor, you have basic questions. What is winning? What is peace? What is the alternative? And all of these questions are today unanswerable. I think when I look at where we are now, I think we are at a precipice. We are not about to fall off the precipice, but, and I think in fact that the outside actors who are kind of quasi-engaged or have a stake in this conflict, whether it's Iran on one side, the United States on the other, several militias in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, that at this point, none of them want a bigger war. But as we all know from the history of conflict, it takes one incident to escalate, to get it out of control, to lead us on a different trajectory. And the algorithm of this war is different than any of the previous conflicts between Israel and the non-state actors, in that in the past, it has been a provocation by one of the militias, an Israeli countered with airstrikes, perhaps small ground actions, but then Qatar and Egypt particularly go in and engage in some kind of temporary ceasefire with the emphasis on temporary. And the problem is that none of the core questions that have defined this conflict, the fate of the Palestinians, the relations between Israel and its Arab or Muslim neighbors, have been addressed since 1948, and there have been attempts. Now, kind of taking my dad always said, to understand any conflict, you have to stand on top of the world and look down. And it's very good advice right now. I think what's important to understand is that since the 1970s, for almost a half century, there has been slowly a tapestry that has been woven by players, whether it's Israel and Egypt first, and then Israel and Jordan, and then now through the Abraham Accords, a tapestry. And the tapestry has, it's not finished, it's partially there, but it was bringing together different threads, different types of government, different ethnicities and religions in what many players intended to be, a way if countries didn't like each other, had different religions, but that could coexist in a kind of cold peace. And my fear is that this war and its consequences, and Aaron is absolutely right, the consequences are just huge, and involve far more than the fate of Israel and Hamas, that tapestry unravels and we get back to zero. And we have to start with pulling the first two threads together. And that's how dangerous it is. And just to give you a sampling of what that might be, does Israel eliminate Hamas, at least, short term, its leadership, destroy its arsenals, its command posts and so forth. But does that lead to, a different evolution, a different idea, a different group emerging? Does this cause such anger and fury among Palestinians in the West Bank that Israel regains temporarily control of Gaza, but loses West Bank as a potential interlocutor? And does this lead governments in the region that have tried or been willing to talk to Israel, does that make it impossible for them to move forward for years to come? That the stakes here are so big. And on the last question, Iran and all of this, I think what's really interesting is that the militias have clearly in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, have been probing, have been the United States forces or places where they have been based have been hit multiple times in Iraq and Syria. Iran's allies in Yemen have allegedly targeted Israel with missiles and drones that were shot down by the US and one by Saudi Arabia. But we haven't seen the escalation yet. And the question is, will that change once the ground assault begins? Or are there certain boundaries that are set in terms of how far the escalation goes? It'll escalate by all of them. They'll be probing, trying to get the US, raise the cost of the US says, oh, we'll pull our forces out of 900 out of Syria and some of the 2,500 out of Iraq, which actually plays into Iran's hand, that it gains side benefits from this conflict. So again, this one, as Aaron rightly said, is just so big and will play out potentially for years to come, even if Israel makes military headway in the not too distant future against Hamas.
All right, so we're going to ask some questions and see how you want to answer them. I'm getting some messages from the team that prepares these, so I don't have anything from the audience yet. But let me ask you this. There is a rumor going on, and I'm interested in what the two of you think, that what's really happening, because the Saudi-Israeli possibility was hurt so badly by this attack, that if Israel is able, and that this is one of the factors for Israel, that if Israel manages to destroy Hamas, that will improve the possibilities of a Saudi-Israeli a new relationship, and of course hurting Iran, it actually increases their relationship. I also have another question. I like to ask more than one, so you could skip one, and that is, this comes from Mary Aline Hegland, Professor Emeritus of Santa Clara University in the United States. Do you think Netanyahu bears any responsibility for all of this by promoting illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land? So why don't we start with Aaron, since he started the first question, has had a moment to rest for, and there are two questions. You can answer one or both. Aaron?
On Saudi Arabia, I think in Israeli politics, the famous saw is that you can be dead or dead and buried. I think that the U.S. Saudi-Israeli normalization process is just dead. It's not closed for the season, but I would note this, that if in fact the destruction of Hamas occurs, and that's something we should talk about. Hamas has an administrative governing sovereign structure. It has a military structure. It's also the organizational embodiment of an idea, and it has deep roots, social and economic, through the dawah, the so-called calling to Palestinians in Gaza since the early 80s. So the destruction of Hamas, and Robin's point is right on, is going to create destruction of Gaza. The death and destruction in Gaza, largely against Palestinians, civilians, is going to undermine the prospects of legitimizing any Palestinian interlocutor that wants to presume to negotiate in the wake of this. MBS is 38 years old. Assuming he gets to be king of Saudi Arabia, he will rule Saudi Arabia arguably for 50 or more years. He will see during those 50 years, 6 or 7, maybe more, American presidents come and go. He is pursuing a 360-degree foreign policy, not tethering himself to the United States. He sees China rising in a Saudi sense, which is important. He's not going to abandon Russia because of the OPEC Plus. I think MBS will survey the wreckage. He wants things from the United States. Much more important, frankly, than what happens on the Palestinian issue for him. That was clearly the case before, but the Palestinian issue will weigh more heavily now. So I think he'll take his time and he'll make a judgment as to whether or not, A, he can get everything he wants from this administration, which is a mutual defense treaty. I might add, the last time the United States submitted a mutual defense treaty for ratification to the US Congress, which then has the force of domestic law. That's what we're talking about. Was 1960, I believe, with a revision of the US-Japan treaty. He wants that from us. I don't know if that's even possible. And he wants American help and the export of our nuclear technology, presumably with the right to control the fuel cycle, either under American auspices or not. I don't know. He'll make an assessment in the wake of this, and then I think he'll proceed. I think I'll defer to Robin in the interest of time. Other question or questions?
Robin?
Oh, Aaron, don't do that to me. I'm going to leave Israeli politics to you. You know that far better than I'll make a couple of points. One, I think that the war erupted not just because of the Saudi-Israel potential deal, and I put the emphasis on potential. I do briefings all the time with the State Department, the White House, the NSC, and they emphasized this was a long way off, that a lot of discussion, but it was hardly imminent. So I think that was maybe a factor in the thinking. But I also think that the discussion by some of the hardline Israeli politicians about what they want to do around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. The operation, as Hamas called it, was Al-Aqsa Flood. And that tells you one of the flashpoints. I also think that there were increasing tensions on the West Bank, and Israel was focused on those tensions, as was the United States when it came to thinking about what the warnings were, what the dangers were. And I think those kinds of factors all came together. War is always a confluence of factors, but it also coincided with Hamas capabilities. And they have been, with each one of their confrontations with Israel, they have grown bigger, worked harder training, built larger arsenals, have worked with their Iranian sponsors and trainers. And so I think that you had all of these things come together, and they felt this was the right time to act for a variety of reasons. And so I think we think too much about the Saudi element. I agree with Aaron. I think MBS, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, is playing the long game. He really wants the US to provide the kind of protection to the kingdom that it does to all its European allies. And I think that's when that got closer, I think that would be a very controversial idea in Washington. I want to say one thing on this Hamas question, and based on the American experience. When we went into Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda. The US liked to claim there was, but intelligence found there wasn't. But Al-Qaeda of Iraq emerged, and the US slowly went after its leadership and managed to kill some of them. And that Al-Qaeda of Iraq evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq. And the US in an airstrike killed that leader. And it only evolved further and wider into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, which seized a third of Iraq and Syrian territory to create a caliphate. Now, the caliphate no longer exists, but ISIS still does, and it also has franchises now on 3 continents. So I think we have to kind of be smart about what is it that, when you say you're going to eliminate Hamas, what is the alternative for the Palestinians? It's clear that Fatah, which rules in the West Bank, has been rejected by the majority and I think the idea that the West Bank might one day assume responsibility for Gaza as a non-starter, I don't think the West Bank would want to do it, would see that as a viable alternative. And we're struggling with what happens in the West Bank, frankly, politically, given the actuarial charts and President Abbas being in his late 80s and having no obvious heir apparent, that the Palestinians are at a more uncertain stage than at any time since they made peace with Israel in 1993, 30 years ago. So again, we need to be careful about, or Israel needs to be smart about what it means by eliminating Hamas and creating an environment that is secure for Israel. I think whatever it does militarily, there are very few ways to guarantee the willingness of the Palestinians after this to want to engage with Israel.
Aaron, do you want to say anything about?
Yeah, I'll address the other question. Look, there's going to be a reckoning. After 1973, the Granat Commission filed an interim report in April of '74, an interim report identifying key military and security officials held responsible for the intelligence failure. It left the prime minister, then Golda Meir, untouched. She was forced by public opinion to resign. There will be a reckoning. In answer to the specific question, at a minimum, the policies pursued by this Israeli government, most extreme fundamentalist, even Jewish supremacist government in the history of the state of Israel, sent unmistakable signals to Israel's adversaries that Israel was divided and weakened and distracted. Now, it'll take a state commission of inquiry to determine exactly what was the relationship, what was the state of readiness, and why did the Israelis not see this coming, and the operational failure that occurred in the time between when these attacks began, anywhere from 3 to 12 hours. And one last point, what is at stake here for the state of Israel is the contract between the governed and those who govern. The legitimacy of government rests on its capacity to protect its citizenry. The government of Israel failed galactically, not only in not anticipating this, but in responding to that. And thereupon, you have the horror stories which will continue to circulate, the hostage situation which will continue to perpetuate them, giving rise to a generation of Israelis scarred by what happened on October 7th. And this Israeli government, like all governments who preside over times good or bad, is responsible for that.
Hard to believe that 3-4 years from now, maybe less, that Netanyahu will be prime minister, but odd things happen sometimes in democratic countries. But he does seem to be in big trouble, at least that's what I would think. Well, we've got the questions, as usually happens, building up. Rabbi Suzanne Singer of Temple Beth El in Los Angeles, I think, she asks, is there a way out of this conflict without pursuing war? Either one of you want to try that? I'm going to give it to Robin because she hasn't gone first yet.
I mean, we are at war. This is the problem. You know, the United States is trying to navigate a path right now where it allows Israel to take action against an adversary. At the same time, it's pressing to open humanitarian corridors from Egypt to get in humanitarian supplies to those who are in a what is loosely called a safe zone, and it isn't. And you know, I think the hard part, you know, you don't have many countries that are willing to actually help the Palestinians right now. Egypt doesn't want to take in refugees, people who were already refugees when they were in Gaza, because it fears ending up responsible for them if there's, you know, if they can't go back to homes or jobs. And I think the United States is also deploying in the Middle East because it wants to avoid a bigger war. It's trying to send a message that there's muscle out there if anybody tries anything bigger, whether it's broader attacks on U.S. forces outside of the region. The U.S. is about to deploy 2,000 personnel on the ground, and we're not sure where. But the danger, as the U.S. learned in Beirut in the early 1980s, is when we deployed peacekeepers and they ended up becoming targets, and the U.S. was forced to withdraw, having failed in its mission. And does the U.S. presence, new U.S. presence in the region, also make them targets? Now, they will provide very powerful defense mechanisms, especially for the firing of missiles on U.S. forces. But again, what happens if a militia in Iraq that's backed by Iran fires something real that kills American troops at Al-Assad Air Base, to pick one example in northern Iraq? What does the U.S. do? Is the U.S. militia? Does it go after the backers in Iran? This is where these flashpoints, that one thing can lead to a much wider war. And I think you have a war, and that's the reality on the ground between Israel and Hamas. And the question now is, can you prevent something bigger? I think you can. I think that's what the U.S. is trying to do. But anytime a major power becomes a player, the U.S. shot down these missiles and drones that were fired by the Houthis in Yemen. So the US has fired its first shot. And in some ways, Iran has too, through its militias in at least 3 countries. And so we're, again, as I said, we're on this precipice, and it's trying to control hold back anybody from, all the players from falling off that precipice right now.
Aaron, do you have anything you want to add, or should we go on?
You've already had 24 American troops wounded, some with traumatic brain injuries, and 1 contractor who died of cardiac arrest. So the idea that pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq would strike American troops has already happened. If in fact they find an actual target and should kill large numbers, you would see you've got 2 carrier strike groups. The second, I think, should be there any day, and over 200 Stryker aircraft involved here. I do not see, if we're talking regional escalation, meaning a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, with Israeli aircraft and missiles striking Iranian territory, going after conventional, unconventional sites, I find it almost impossible to imagine the US would stay out of that. I think that probability is still quite low. An escalation between Israel and Hezbollah, which would be far more deadly than the summer of 2006, where I will remind everyone that 5,000 guys in a militia with relatively unsophisticated high trajectory weapons shut down the northern half of the Middle East's most preeminent military power for 34 days. That was 17 years ago. That is an escalation worth worrying about. And I don't have an answer as to whether or not that can be avoided.
Can I just add one thing, Steve?
Sure.
And that this week we marked the 40th anniversary of the Beirut bombing, where 241 American peacekeepers and 58 French peacekeepers were killed by what was an embryo of Hezbollah. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion on Earth since World War II. And the U.S. always said it was going to get revenge for that, and it hasn't. But it lurks in the minds of many still at the Pentagon. And I agree with Aaron. I don't see for the moment Israel going after Iran, but I wouldn't be surprised at all, given that Israel has struck airports in Syria, both in Damascus and Aleppo, that Israel goes after Iranian facilities or munitions that are not in Iran, but are in countries that weaponry that could be used against Israel. I think it's preemptively engaged in actions. What I worry about is the scenario where there's something between Iran and the United States. Israel's not going to go after Iran's nuclear facilities right now. That's just a non-starter. It doesn't have the capabilities or the will to launch a bigger war right now. I do think that Bibi, if he's still in power, or those of his political ilk, will want Iran to pay a price, since it is complicit in all the activities, the training, the funding, the weaponry of its proxy allies in the so-called axis of resistance in the Middle East. There will be some kind of cost exacted down the road, but I don't think now. The danger is the tripwire is set by some kind of, again, as these militias in the region probe, attack American targets, and what is the red line for the United States on that? And we saw this happen after the death of Soleimani, when the U.S. assassinated the head of a Revolutionary Guard elite unit when he was visiting Baghdad, and Iran responded in the largest launch of missiles against U.S. forces since the Korean War by attacking firing missiles at al-Assad, the base I mentioned earlier in northern Iraq. And the U.S., both sides stopped there. The question is, would both sides stop there in a similar action, similar confrontation as a consequence of this war? Passions are running so deep. Fury and fear are so profound that the danger is that we react in ways that just provoke another round and a bigger escalation.
All right. We have from Cairo, Egypt, Mohammed Nasir. I hope I have that name right. And he asks a very interesting question. Is valuing normalization between Arabs and Israel at the expense of true peace what caused the recent attack by Hamas? Either one of you?
It's a question that raises a very complicated and fraught series of issues. Thought experiment. The Biden administration comes to Washington in January of 2021, a lot of other priorities, right? Eventually big priorities with China and Russia and Ukraine. But instead of focusing largely on the Israeli-Arab interstate process, which they did, which the Trump administration began, it chooses to focus to some degree, not pushing for a major comprehensive settlement between Israelis and Palestinians, which frankly has been out of reach for, in my judgment, decades, decides to devote greater attention to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Okay? Would the Hamas attack of October 7 still happen? Would it have happened anyway? Because I've encountered people who blame this attack on Joe Biden, on ignoring the Israeli-Palestinian problem, on focusing on Israeli-Saudi normalization, and on the last 4 administrations, frankly, 1 or 2 of which I was involved in, that simply didn't try to deal seriously with the Israeli-Palestinian problem. My answer is the Hamas attack would probably have happened anyway, because what we know about the peace process, the more progress is made, the greater vulnerability it presents to extremist groups of all persuasions. So I think that Israeli-Saudi normalization may have been a factor in Iranian thinking and in Hamas's thinking, because after all, if the Israelis and the Saudis normalize the entire notion of an axis of resistance composed of Hezbollah and Iran, 2 Shia actors, and a very important Sunni component, which lends legitimacy to this axis of resistance, might have been threatened. I don't think, frankly, had the Biden administration focused on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that with any degree of certainty, we could have predicted that there would have been no Hamas attack.
Robin, do you want to get in, or should we move on?
So I just quickly say, first of all, I think we forget that Iran and Saudi Arabia had renewed relations for the first time in 7 years. They'd reopened embassies and they were talking to each other, actually picking up the phone in the middle of this crisis. So that, I might differ a little bit with Aaron on that point. I think the problem for the Biden administration is that it was trying to transition to the 21st century. And we've got sucked back into the 20th century in 2 wars, one in Ukraine facing our old Cold War nemesis, and one with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Biden was determined, as a guy who spent his whole life doing foreign policy, to deal with the biggest challenge facing the United States militarily, economically, diplomatically in the world, and which will be true for most of the 21st century. And the problem is that we thought we could try a different tact in dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, broaden something that the Trump administration had started, that the Obama administration had worked on. And you go back president, and there have been this, again, this tapestry, all these little threads that have been sewn together, and that it hoped that that by dealing with isolating Putin and trying to deal with China, or belittling the Russian dimension, that it could move on, and it found out that it couldn't, and that's the great challenge. And I think when I look at the intersection of these 2 wars, right now, and the bigger questions of democracies being increasingly dysfunctional, societies, democratic societies being increasingly polarized, I worry a lot about how historians will look back on this juncture and think about how we blew it. That all the institutions we built after World War II, the United Nations, which has been incapacitated and is not even a player really in these conflicts, doesn't have much credibility, whatever the good intentions of its leadership, that the ideas of diplomacy, the rules of engagement and warfare, that a lot of the rules, the institutions, the ideas established after World War II, Human Rights Declaration, are all kind of up in smoke. And so I think that as we think about this war in a state the size of Delaware and New Jersey against Gaza, which is the size of Philadelphia, that this has global repercussions in all kinds of ways.
All right. Now we have Steve Zipperstein, who was part of our team as the professor at UCLA, and he asked the following question: who are other winners and losers in the region and beyond as a result of the October 7th Hamas surprise attack on Israel? Either one of you want to try that?
If you stopped, I'll take it. It's a sort of a flip comment. If you stopped the clock today, right now, and you froze the status quo, I would say that Iran, the axis of resistance, Hamas, and one counterintuitive winner, which would be Israeli democracy, because the judicial overhaul has been buried, I would argue, permanently as a consequence of what happened. It's a tragic, horrific sequence of events, but I think that may actually be, I hate even to use the word, I mean, right now I see very little that is positive anywhere. But if you stop the clock now, I think that those would be the four winners.
I'd love to weigh in on that. I actually think there are no winners. I think that Iran could lose its proxy in Hamas, at least short term. It's invested a lot in funding and armory and so forth, and it's lost that potential wing. So I'm not sure that it wins very much, and Iran is under more scrutiny now than it has been in a long time. At a time that it, is joining BRICS, it's renewing relations. It's trying to be get some recognition as a legitimate state instead of being a constant pariah. I think the big winner out of all of this, when we look at it historically, will be China, looking at the United States deploying its warships in the Eastern Mediterranean, providing arms to Israel and Ukraine, and paying less attention to what China feels free to do, whatever it wants, And so again, I want to think of this in a global context, not just the region, where I actually think there are no winners. I think Israel's going to pay a huge price. The Palestinians are clearly going to pay a big price. I think there are the governments that have tried to make peace with Israel are going to find it very hard to move forward or do anything meaningful. The Saudi deal, such as it possibly was, is dead in the water for now. I just, I don't see anybody coming out of this in a traditional sense a real winner.
Okay, Rima, and I hope I've got this right, Skayer of Tunisia. Do you think the mass protests and advocacy efforts worldwide in solidarity with Palestine, but especially in Europe and North America, will push for a ceasefire in Gaza? Either one of you?
Well, they push for a ceasefire. There's already calls at the UN, both the Security Council and the General Assembly, for a ceasefire. I don't see a ceasefire. I see possibility the administration has raised the issue of humanitarian pauses. That could happen if there was a massive release of hostages. But no, the United States has a veto power in the Security Council. UN General Assembly resolutions don't carry the force of imperatives. So it's hard for me to see any formal ceasefire kicking into place right now.
Can I add one thought on the hostage issue, because it's one I've covered. I covered the takeover of the U.S. embassy in Iran in 1979, and stood at the foot of the steps of the plane in Algeria when they flew to freedom, and in Beirut when Hezbollah was seizing dozens of Americans, one of them being Terry Anderson, who had the office next door to mine, and he was chained to a radiator for 7 years. That I think the hostage drama may well drag on long after the cessation of hostilities, that this is the largest leverage that the Hamas still has, and will exact a big price. I suspect it may allow more women, children, elderly out, but I think it will keep many of the men. And when we look back on the last big prisoner exchange, Israel took 5 years to get Gilad Shalit out, and in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. So the fact that Hamas has over 200, or is believed to still have over 200, that gives it enormous leverage in exacting different kinds of concessions from Israel. The human drama adds enormous amount, as we saw when Americans went through hostage ordeals, and the yellow ribbon became as much a symbol of America as apple pie and baseball.
Steve, can I just add a point to that?
Sure.
It's a cruel dilemma that the government of Israel faces. On one hand, they have a commitment to, I'll use the word avenging, but more proactively preventing anything like what has happened to 1,400 Israelis from ever happening again. On one hand, their commitment to the dead, but on the other hand, they have a national priority, a mission, and a commitment to the living. And when I refer to the living here, I'm talking about the 150 hostages. This is not a strictly or mostly American story. I mean, there are 10 Americans unaccounted for, whether or not, and here's where the opacity, the opaqueness of the hostage issue kicks in. We have no good sense. The administration may, the Israelis may, have more details on this. But how does any government make a choice? I think that the fate of the hostages, once the ground campaign begins, and if it is true, and there have been reports that individual Palestinians and or families have hostages. Israelis dropped leaflets over the last several days offering financial rewards to Palestinians who would provide information on where the hostages are located. I can't believe they would have dropped those leaflets if they didn't have some sense that Hamas and PIJ, Palestine Islamic Jihad, don't have control over all of the hostages. I think their situation becomes increasingly fraught once an Israeli operation begins.
Dragana Alexander of the UC Office of the President. Is the U.S. really president of the universities in California, the major universities? Is the U.S. really pro-Israel and Arab solidarity, plus Arab solidarity? Does the U.S. really want a stronger Israel? Do they at the same time try to keep them down just as much as supporting them?
I turn over to Aaron on this one.
I have no problem answering this question. If the question is the United States pro-Israel, I didn't really catch the other part of the question.
Is the U.S. is really pro-Israel plus Arab solidarity? Does the U.S. really want a stronger Israel? Do they at the same time try to keep them down just as much as supporting them?
Keep who down? I mean, it's not. I mean, with all due respect to the questioner, it's a tad confusing. Look, I think that if someone said to me on October 6th, how do you think the administration would react in the event Hamas brutally and savagely and indiscriminately killed 1,400 Israelis, including 260 at the Nova Music Festival, which now stands as the largest single concert catastrophe, passing the Bataclan Paris concert which 130 people were killed, 260 Israelis were shot and murdered, I would have said the administration would react in a very pro-Israel manner. One, because of the brutality and slaughter of October 7th. Two, because you have an American president. And the presidential model here is not Barack Obama, it's Bill Clinton. They're a generation apart, but their views on Israel are incredibly similar. Both believe, for emotional and political reasons, support for Israel is imprinted on their emotional and political DNA. And you saw that in the October 10 speech that Biden gave, which is one of the most powerful of his presidency. You saw that in the visit. And the unmistakable signal that the administration sent initially was we're going to give the Israelis the time, the space, and the support to do what they think they need to do with respect to Hamas and Gaza. Now, that frame has begun to evolve over the course of the last 2 weeks in response to the humanitarian catastrophe that is continuing to occur in Gaza, the deaths of thousands of Palestinians, and the destruction as a consequence of an Israeli blockade and Israeli airstrikes designed to pressure Hamas and to presumably pave the way for an Israeli ground campaign. That's one factor. Second, the hostages. The administration has bought time and space from the Israelis to allow possible negotiations to free more. And three, I think the administration, they sent a 3-star general with experience in counterinsurgency, which is frankly fascinating to me. They are intimately now involved in at least raising questions on what the Israelis intend to do. Do they have the means at their disposal to do it? And more important, what about the day after? So I think the administration's position has evolved. The president yesterday made a fascinating comment, warning in very strong terms about Israeli settlers who were killing Palestinians. That was certainly in response to an effort to broaden the frame to be sensitive, more sensitive to what is happening to Palestinians on the ground. But on balance, the answer to the question is we are not an honest broker when it comes to these matters. We have a special relationship with Israel for any number of reasons, and I think you saw that reflected in the president's view. One additional point, the logic of trying to get close to the Israelis during a crisis to inspire trust and confidence by an American president is presumably designed, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, to be able to have additional leverage for the hard conversations and the tough conversations that are certain to follow. And I'm saying to you, we haven't even begun, I think, to encounter those tough conversations. They will come in the event the Israelis do, in fact, launch a massive ground campaign, which they may not. At any rate, it's my sense.
All right. First of all, I want to say we're running out of time, and therefore we're not going to. We've got we've got a few questions left. I'm trying to get them all in, but we're not going to accept more questions any longer. You can let us know, and we'll try to get them answered. Let's see here. We have Samir Shawa from Gaza, living in London with large family in Gaza. There are many American Palestinians gathered at Rafah crossing for 2 weeks, trying to leave Gaza via Egypt, but the administration is unable to find a solution for them. Would a ground invasion really destroy Hamas and save the hostages? Either one of you want to start that?
I'd make a comment, not on the latter 2 points. I think
Comment. We have to go on anyway, so let's make.
But on American citizens, anywhere from 400 to 600, I do not. This is where it's really opaque. I do not understand. Those people are essentially hostages. Why haven't they been able to leave Rafah? I have no explanation for that. Tony Blinken 2 days ago said it was because Hamas was blocking them from leaving. I've heard reports that the Egyptians are not because Hamas is checking people through that crossing. Egypt is literally micromanaging any human that goes through that crossing. I have no explanation, but it is a serious demonstration of, actually, I'm not sure what, because I can't understand why those American citizens have not been able to leave.
Okay, we've got Natalie Brill, a member of CTJ Synagogue. I assume it's in Los Angeles. I could be wrong. Don't you think that getting rid of Hamas will help the Palestinians, as they are a terrorist organization? Shouldn't we all, excuse me, all hope that eliminating terrorism should be a goal to create a state for the Palestinians?
I'll take that briefly. Look, the United States pressed the Palestinians to hold an election in 2006 on the premise that the belief that Fatah would win, and Fatah was willing to engage with the Israelis. And it turned out that the Palestinians were disillusioned with the corruption, nepotism, mismanagement of Fatah, felt that they had not in 13 years managed to make any progress on the Oslo Accords. And a lot of them, I covered that election, I was on the ground, and it was clear that Hamas was going to win, and it did. So, and the irony is that Israel actually encouraged the creation of an Islamist alternative to the PLO back in the late 1980s, because it thought, as a religious movement, not a nationalist movement, it was not going to be a challenge. And so both Israel and the United States bear some culpability for what has become Hamas. This is where sometimes you have one intention, as the United States did in Iraq, and something else happens. So yeah, I think the majority of Palestinians may not support Hamas right now. The polling that's been done shows that many still support the idea of some kind of resistance to Israel, because they're so angry that there has not been any agreement that gives them freedom, dignity, and ends the blockade that's gone on for more than a decade. The danger, as I said earlier, is you don't kill the idea of resistance, even if you manage to kill many of the leaders. The Israelis assassinated the founder of Islamic Jihad, and it's been a major factor. Is believed to hold some of the hostages, and has engaged in its own clashes with Israel. So this is where, yes, absolutely, none of it. We should all reject all forms of terrorism. The question is, how do you find political solutions to military confrontations? And it always involves politics. Every major war has been ended formally because of politics and diplomacy. And that's where we don't see, both Aaron and I think we don't see how this plays out in a way that achieves Israel's goals of peace and security, and also provides a solution for the Palestinians. And there are two sides and two parties to a conflict, and guns alone, killing alone, doesn't solve the problem.
Okay, so we move on.
Steve, could I just, I think that's a great answer on Robin's part. Can I just make a public service announcement, but it's also educational? Next Thursday at noon, I'm interviewing Khalil Shikaki, who is, for my money, the preeminent Palestinian pollster and analyst in these matters. And we're going to unpack the issue. We're going to unpack the issue of Palestinian support for Hamas. So I will send you an invite. You can circulate it as if appropriate.
And can I just point out something there? I did a book, and I profiled Khalil and his brother. And how within one family, you see two brothers close, growing up together, take very different paths. Khalil teaches at Brandeis. He engages actively with Jewish groups. He was very involved with the secret peace negotiations with Israel back in the early 90s. He is as thoughtful as you will ever find on the issue of the Palestinians, with data, not just the kind of emotions. But it was his brother who founded Islamic Jihad. So, yeah, and so this is again that it is, how do you direct the energy of people in a way that they are willing to coexist with each other. And that applies to both sides.
And one of them is a very close friend of Israelis, and the other one was killed by the Israelis.
Yes.
So amazing. Yes. All right. Ekmani Habib from Sudan. One of the possibilities of building an international alliance, including countries from the Arab world, to fight Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Iran elements to form the new Middle East. If plausible, how successful would this idea be? Can we have a quick answer?
It was successful in terms of the international coalition to defeat Daesh, the Islamic State. But an international coalition to fight Hamas in Gaza strikes me as a very bad idea, and it's not feasible. Some sort of security force might be part of the day after, which could be underwritten and resourced by the international community. But even that at this point is more theory than practice.
All right. We're trying to get so many in. I'm going to ask two here that have been, I've been very close to the end. We all understand the undivided support that the U.S. provides to Israel. Do you think it's wise if the U.S. forces get involved on the ground? What implications will such a move cause other fronts to join, like Lebanon and Iran? And from Moha Enaji from Morocco, an old friend, what will happen if Israel invades Gaza? How will Hezbollah and Iran react? Is the two-state solution still viable? We can spend hours on this, but let's try not to.
I think I answered the question about what if the U.S. puts troops on the ground. The fact is they may demonstrate muscle symbolically, but do they also become targets? We have to be very wise about where we deploy, under what terms, and understand what types of actions will elicit U.S. intervention. We need to be incredibly careful. We have a long history of intervening in the Middle East and failing time after time, and leading to American deaths too.
Okay, so do we have Aaron, do you have the other question?
Two-state solution, even though the vast number of humans, many of whom I respect deeply, believe that the two-state solution has gone the way of the dodo. I still cling to the notion that it is the least bad solution to resolve this conflict, because it is the only solution that deals with the demographic, geographic, religious, and political roots of this conflict. There is no precedent for two national groups competing for religious space and territory to be housed either in a one-state reality controlled by Israel, which is a prescription for unending conflict or violence, or in some one-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians live happily ever after. Separation through negotiation, in my judgment, is the only way. There is no alternative, even if it ends up being a confederal structure. Separation through negotiation is the only way to produce anything remotely resembling a conflict-ending solution.
All right, I have 3 questions left. I'm going to ask them all and see what you can do, because we're at our end. Antonio from Athens, Greece, also a close friend. The situation on the ground remains fast-moving and complex, but once the Israel-Hamas war ends, how feasible and realistic would it be to create a new roadmap for re-engaging Israel and Palestine in a comprehensive peace process? A friend of ours, very close. Mary Elaine Hagelin from the USA, given the anger and distress of Arab and Muslim nations, do you think the attack on Palestinians, will lead to World War III? And I believe there was one other, I didn't ask you. Eric Selkar from the USA, do you think Israel should have released all the glory pictures and videos so the world would understand that just like Nazi Germany, nothing justifies such violence and Hamas cannot be allowed to exist? ? Lots of other questions. Some were double people had asked earlier. I apologize if we missed you, but we did get most of you. And now, not so nice, we ask our speakers to do what they can for the last 3 questions.
I'd say no on World War III, a categoric no. on releasing pictures. The Israelis have already released a compilation of footage from Hamas headcams to foreign journalists. I have not seen them, but I think they underscore the savagery and the brutality and the intentional indiscriminate killing, which crossed a new threshold, which will echo for a very, very long time.
And Robin, do you have any thought?
Not World War III, because you don't have, I mean, this is one that involves the region. You're not going to see Russia and China play any major role. So I don't think on that question. I think, this business of our idea of having another roadmap. I mean, the roadmap has gone, any number of roadmaps have gone no place. That they really, if there is some kind of movement, it needs to be very swift and not kind of be a handshake and let's figure out the details later. I don't think that's going to work. You need something kind of, this is cataclysmic in terms of the war, and it needs some kind of huge, dynamic, tangible agreement or deal to move forward. And I don't see that coming anytime soon, alas. On the pictures, the problem is the internet. And one of the most, it's beyond control. And I've read already that there's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and whether it's by both sides, I don't know the numbers, but I just have seen a lot of reporting on that, that exploiting the tragedies that are playing out on the ground. And you don't need, I mean, one picture alone can tell you how awful this is. And so anyway, I hope that we can have another conversation on a more hopeful basis, but we are at that turning point. We talk about inflection points all the time, but this is one that affects everybody. And let's hope people react thoughtfully and look for solutions, alternatives that are tangible, not just the vague idea of winning or avenging, because that doesn't produce a tangible outcome for all of us.
Just one additional point to add to Robin's eloquent finish. If I worry about one thing, it's the absence of leadership.
Yeah.
Anything that's going to happen, anything in a positive, meaningful way, will depend on Israeli and Palestinian leaders who are not prisoners of their politics or their ideologies, but who have invested in this because they believe it is actually in the best interest of their people. It's going to depend on American leadership to stand up and adopt an approach that is perceived to be equitable and durable in terms of moving toward a solution. But without leadership, we're going to drift. And we know what happens when we drift.
Well, I can't thank the two of you enough. I knew you'd be the best, of course, and you are, and it was. And I hope that everyone has a feeling for the situation that it might not have had before, the pluses and the minuses, of course. And that's why they're so great. That's why Aaron and Robin are so great, because they understand the good and the bad. So thank you. And maybe we can talk about something positive before long. Doesn't seem like that right now, but maybe I'm wrong. But still, we are all going to fight for the good. And that's why we are where we are. And I'd like to thank our team for creating this opportunity for us to talk today. Manny Jed, Salmi Mahajer, Emily Pistole, and Lori Lee. CMED has quite a bit to offer in the next few weeks. Please see our screen for upcoming weekly discussions in this roundtable series. And we're so fortunate to have the very best with us for our opening, but we know the others that you see now will be important as well in terms of our series on the Hamas attack and its impact on the region. If you have not already joined our mailing list, please add your name. Link is on the screen, or send a message to us at CMED, CMED at international.ucla.edu. And so I hope to see you soon. And let me say, for all of us, bye for now.